Monsieur l'ambassadeur, monsieur l'administrateur, chers collègues, chers amis, mesdames, messieurs, cher Orhan Pamuk, le plaisir et l'honneur sont immenses de vous accueillir toutes et tous ce soir en cet amphithéâtre Marguerite de Navarre à la première des 4 conférences que donnera tout au long de ce mois de mai Orhan Pamuk sur l'art du roman, conférences qui sont intitulées de manière énigmatique « The paradoxe of the novelist », le paradoxe du romancier. Ces conférences seront données en anglais, mais grâce au soutien de la délégation générale à la langue française et aux langues de France du ministère de la Culture et au soutien de son délégué général, M. Paul de Sinetti, ces conférences bénéficient d'une traduction simultanée en français, ce qui permet à toutes celles et tous ceux qui le souhaitent de pouvoir vivre en direct ces moments exceptionnels. L'ensemble de ces conférences est par ailleurs enregistré et sera diffusé plus tard sur les réseaux habituels et sur le site du Collège de France. Je voudrais remercier également la Fondation Hugo du Collège de France et sa directrice, Madame Florence Terrasse-Rioux, pour leur soutien indéfectible sans lesquels cette invitation n'aurait pu se faire. Et maintenant, si vous le voulez bien, permettez-moi de profiter de cette traduction simultanée pour passer à l'anglais et me faire entendre également de notre conférencier. I had a dream. More than 1 year ago, 1 year and a half exactly, in October 2021, I met Orhan Pamuk for the first time. I did not meet him in flesh and blood, actually. I was here on this stage, and Orhan Pamuk was in New York City. But he was here on this screen. The journalist Émilie Aubry was also here, and together, the 3 of us, we made for RT-TV a broadcast about the relationship between East and West and between Turkey and Europe in particular, about the way they mirror each other in their imagination as well as in reality. And we also questioned the power of literature in this kind of situation. And this was an exciting event. And a small coincidence happened, a coincidence I interpreted as a sign. In New York City, Orhan Pamuk had an interpreter to translate the French into English for him, and this interpreter was actually, by chance, my own translator who translated 2 of my books into English. And I am happy to name him now and greet him, if he's there somewhere, Nicholas Elliott. And from that time, I had a dream, and this dream was to invite Orhan Pamuk to the Collège de France so that he could give for the chair of comparative literatures a series of lectures about literature. The assembly of the professors of the Collège de France agreed about the invitation, and now this dream of mine has come true. Orhan Pamuk is here, and I believe my eyes. Actually, this dream came from farther away. For a long time, in literature, particularly in French literature, there was a loss of confidence in the powers of fiction. There was a contraction of the territory of literature. It was, in the words of Nathalie Sarraute, the era of suspicion, l'ère du soupçon against the novel. But elsewhere, in other literatures in the world, things were different. A different regime of literature reigned in other parts of the world. And in 2006, there came an explosive moment. The Nobel Prize for Literature was awarded to Orhan Pamuk. And for those who were not yet familiar with his work, the feeling was one of the feeling of doors and windows being opened to let in the free air. When you read Orhan Pamuk, you have the feeling that the imagination has been let loose. In Orhan Pamuk's novels, the dead speak. We can hear their voice. Objects tell love stories. Poetry is given a place in the novel. Great historical epics take place. The novel is rooted in a territory, in the architecture of a city, in the most remote countryside of a great country, and at the same time, it is accessible for those readers who live outside of this territory. And then love, love, love always was there as the driving force of the novel. And you will have recognized here in these mentions in no particular order, The Black Book, My Name is Red, Snow, The Museum of Innocence, The Red-Haired Women, Nights of Plague, among other novels. This is, with Orhan Pamuk, the resurrection of what we called in French, but there is no real translation in English, the resurrection of le romanesque, or what is the essence of the novel. It is not the same thing as romanesque in English. The romanesque in its highest form. And this is world literature at its best. With Pamuk, we have a writer of lyrical expression, but also a writer of the passage between people and cultures, a writer of the Bosphorus, and deeply rooted in Turkish culture, and at the same time, a writer of the world, steeped in European literature. He has an exceptional position in the world, that of an immense writer of Muslim culture who is deeply committed to human rights, to freedom of expression, and to the dialogue between peoples. Considered a protester in his country, Pamuk has criticized the rise of Islamism, social injustice, and the lack of freedom of expression. He was the first writer in the Muslim world to publicly condemn the Islamic fatwa issued against Salman Rushdie in 1989. He also acknowledged in the press Turkey's guilt in the Kurdish massacres and the Armenian genocide, which earned him death threats and a summons to appear in court. In 2013, he defended the Turkish protest movement and the Taksim Square demonstrators. With 5 other Nobel laureates, Mikhail Gorbachev, Desmond Tutu, Dario Fo, Günter Grass, and Rita Levi-Montalcini, he had published a text denouncing the fate of Roberto Salviano, who has a price on his head by the mafia in Italy. His courage, his independence, his moral and political demands have made Orhan Pamuk an exceptional voice that is listened to throughout the world. Orhan Pamuk is a Turkish citizen and the most famous cultural representative of Turkey today, I think. But he is also a citizen of the world, a global voice in Istanbul, in Paris, as in New York, where he is a professor at Columbia University too. All this is extraordinary, but Orhan Pamuk would not have the strength necessary for his struggles if he did not anchor this strength in literature and in the novel. That is to say, in the power to speak for others, to speak in the place of others. And Orhan Pamuk possesses this power to the highest degree. And he also has the ability to reflect on this power of literature and to think about it. He has the ability to theorize his art, to make this reflection accessible to all, to make people understand its issues and mechanisms. American and British novelists Henry James and E.M. Forster are great novelists who have thought about the art of the novel. Orhan Pamuk is definitely in this line of reflection about the novel. And I am not unaware of the irony of welcoming Orhan Pamuk this year to this chair of comparative literatures when I have just devoted my course and my work to the edition of the Cours de Poétique given here at the Collège de France by Paul Valéry. Paul Valéry, who, Orhan Pamuk's father was a great admirer and reader, but Paul Valéry, who, as we know, made a profession of hating and despising the novel. Today, however, I welcome in the person of Orhan Pamuk the novelist par excellence, the essence of the novel incarnated. The marquise went out at 5 o'clock. La marquise sortit à 5 heures, Paul Valéry said to caricature the novel. With Pamuk's novels, however, it is not only the marquise who appears, but a whole people who emerge, who speak, who tell stories, who express their ideas and feelings, who confront us with the very enigma of existence. Pamuk is the power of storytelling par excellence. So take this invitation to Orhan Pamuk as a compliment to Valéry's poetics. Orhan Pamuk will make you realize what Valéry was not able to understand about the novel. In 2009, Orhan Pamuk gave a series of lectures at Harvard University, the Charles Eliot Norton Lectures, which he later published as The Naive and the Sentimental Novelist. Those lectures are models of the genre, and this essay on the art of the novel has become a classic already. 14 years later, Orhan Pamuk is returning to this reflection and completing it, and it is here and now at the Collège de France. These lectures will also be published soon, and I have no doubt that they too will become classics. All that remains now for me is to yield the floor to Orhan Pamuk. But first, I must perform an important ritual. It is not only at my suggestion, but at the invitation of the entire assembly of professors that Orhan Pamuk will give his 4 lectures as a guest speaker at the Collège de France. It is therefore in this respect that I have the pleasure and the honor, on behalf of the administrator of the Collège de France, to present Orhan Pamuk with, okay, here it is, with the medal of the Collège de France, which bears the beautiful figures of the founder and inspirer of the Collège, the humanist Guillaume Budet.
Thank you so much for this sweet introduction. A little bit of exaggeration, if it's a praise, is pardoned. I am very happy to be here, and I'm also very happy to William Marx and Collège de France for giving me opportunity to express and talk about my experience of writing novels for the last 50 years. Let's see what I talk about my 50 years. I will deliver, as William said, 4 lectures, general title being The Paradoxe of the Novelist, and the first lecture is, of course, about beginning. I have been writing novels for 50 years, and when I write, there is always a great deal occupying my mind. All the things I intend to write, things I am doing automatically and without even intending to, and even things I hadn't realized I was doing. I have sometimes felt the impulse to list all that I knowingly and unknowingly do while writing a novel. Those processes will be the subject of these lectures. When I first started writing novels 50 years ago, Roland Barthes' famous essay, Death of the Author, La Mort d'Auteur, don't worry, this is my only French that I will go into, had recently been published, becoming popular enough that we'd heard about it even in Turkey. I decided then that my political and ethical convictions and my own life and personal experiences were not that important compared to my efforts as a novelist. This is what I thought as I wrote my first novel at the age of 24. Of course, my books would be rooted in my own life and my own political views, but it was going to be much more interesting to discover which acquired styles and principles, which creative techniques, devices, and deceptions, what darknesses and uncertainties I would turn to in order to communicate those intentions. What mattered most then were not my own personal intentions, but the intentions of the text and the message it was trying to convey. I still feel that way today. The most important thing is not the writer's political, ethical, aesthetic purpose, but the purpose of the text. Over the course of 50 years spent writing, I have also accumulated another kind of knowledge, what I would like to call a compilation of nuances and practicalities of the novelist's craft. I have chosen to use the word craft similar to the word of a carpenter or a jeweler rather than art, to make it clear that I am referring here to knowledge gained by doing the work itself, and though much trial and error. My starting point, in other words, is not theoretical. Writing novels for 15 years in a steady, disciplined, even systematic fashion has enabled me to accumulate a variety of memoirs, experiences, and personal insights on what it is that I do when I write and how it is that I do it, or put more simply, on how I go about writing a novel. This knowledge that cannot be reduced solely to any one among lived experience, political and ideological motivation, or literary style and technique. If I were to share this information with a broader, wider audience, as I am doing now, through a class or an essay, the title of the resulting book or lecture series might perhaps be How to Write a Novel. For the substance of what I will be talking about is made up not so much of the analysis of an existing work or correlation, but rather of suggestions, memoirs, advice, and ideas based on personal experience that might show the best way to devise something that wasn't there before and which requires a certain craftsman-like effort to produce a novel. But I would not wish for the how-to handbook feel of these lectures to put off any literary scholars now that we are in Collège de France. The experiences that I will share with you from my own and from other novelists' working lives will touch upon subjects of academic appeal, which we might summarize under the heading of How do you write a novel, as well as areas of literary and personal interests, including questions of ideology, politics, representation, and autobiography. The insights I will discuss here could also be more straightforwardly described as simple suggestions, words of warning, and advice of the kind that theories of literature or identity are not usually interested in. In short, during these lectures, I will be sharing some of the subtleties that I have discovered through extensive practice in my ongoing work as a novelist. Allow me to clarify with an example. For me, the greatest master of all is Tolstoy, Count Leon Tolstoy. I have read many biographies of Tolstoy with both a critical eye and in the innocence of a true fan. In one popular biography, I remember reading the following remark attributed to Tolstoy. Tolstoy says, if one of the characters in the novel you're writing is too villainous and evilish, if he is a bad person, add a little goodness into him. And if the characters are too good, make them a little evilish. Throughout my career as a novelist, I have never forgotten this maxim, and I have made good use of it too. We will return to this particular piece of advice in our third and fourth weeks when we explore the topic of how a protagonist, a character in a novel, is created and put together. In these lectures, I will touch upon many other writers' words of wisdom which, similar to this craftsman-like utterance of Tolstoy, based on his own wealth of experience, have often shown me the way over the course of my life as a novelist. Writers don't usually share this kind of simple, practical advice with others. These are the secrets of the trade. This is almost a medieval expression. If you explain how you cooked a dish, you'll ruin the flavor. So it is best to describe your novel as if it had come to you in a moment of celestial inspiration, exposing stitches, the corrections, the traces of your craft will erode the perfection of your work. It can undermine the perception of your text as the transcendent product of a burst of a creative ingenuity, and one that is, in its final form, untouchable. This explains why, barring certain exceptional circumstances, novelists tend to hoard their wisdoms like treasure. Perhaps I should have called these lectures Confessions of a Novelist instead. One of the questions us novelists are most often asked is, how did you write this novel? It's a question that is simultaneously a compliment. The more effective, the more interesting the structure or plot of your novel, the more often you'll be asked this question. The readers want to figure out why your novel has had a particular effect on them. This is at the same time the reader's attempt to understand themselves through literature. The question also contains a longing to remember the world of the novel, to go back and add to it, to wonder again therein. But most of all, it reflects a desire to find out how that world was created in the first place. In other words, to learn its formula, the novel's formula, understand the mechanism behind the spell it weaves, and in so doing, step beyond its veil. The keen interest generated by this question is also useful to book critics. Another equally popular question goes as follows. How did you start writing this novel? There is a certain kinship between these two questions related to the very popular misconception, which states that once you started writing your novel, you are basically already halfway there. The truth is that some of the greatest, most brilliant writers of all time have had drawers full of novels, began with great enthusiasm, but never finished. I will talk a little about them today. But first, let me ask this. Are novelists really the most reliable witnesses to the conception, evolution, and completion of their own novels? Be prepared to greet everything I tell you with a hint of suspicion. I may not be a trustworthy witness to the meaning of the novels I write, but on the subject of how I write and finish a novel, there is no better witness than me. Let's begin with the most common illusion there is around the genesis and construction of a novel and how the writing process begins. In my opinion, the most rampant and most common misapprehension concerning the art of the novel, and one shared by a vast audience ranging from ordinary readers to academic researchers, is that novels awaken, come alive, and are conceived in their writer's mind all of a sudden. It is a misapprehension, a wrong idea, inspired by certain mythical scenes from the history of popular science. Think of Archimedes shouting, "Eureka!" after a sudden flash of insight in the bath leads him to discover the buoyancy of water. I suspect that many readers, journalists, literary critics believe that novels too materialize in their author's mind in a similarly sudden eureka moment. They seem to think that if a novel is a tree composed of 10,000 leaves, 500 branches, we're going to talk all about them, and one main trunk, the talented novelist must have conceived all of them all at once. Before I embark on a more detailed and analytical dissection of this misunderstanding, this misapprehension encouraged by all sorts of popular myths about the nature of inspiration, I will begin with a more emotional response. A novel is not a short poem. Being a novelist is like setting off on a long, long and patient journey, sometimes endless. Being a novelist is like a long-distant runner. Sometimes the run ends longer than you expected. Being a novelist, it means writing and rewriting non-stop, figuring things out as you write. Now, let us turn to the more reasoned response. In order to write and rewrite, you have to begin somewhere. In this first week, I will talk about the initial discovery of that beginning, how it is examined and settled upon, and eventually remembered, and at times even mythologized. As I have already said, starting a novel doesn't mean having already thought through its every facet, and if the novel is a tree, it is impossible to envision, to see in your mind's eye, or indeed to have conceived of the trunk, the branches and the leaves all at the same time. I could repurpose this conclusion into useful advice for writing a novel. Always remember that you should start writing your novel well before you thought through every detail it will contain. I have always discovered the most important details of my novels, their leaves, so to speak, and I will use this expression in these lectures, while writing the novel itself. By the time we have finished writing, that first detail, that first leaf we were so excited about when we started off and ends up being not that important at all. Let me give you an example from one of my favorite novels. In 1956, William Faulkner gave an interview to the Paris Review in which he spoke of the first leaf of one of his most remarkable novels, The Sound and the Fury. In the interview, Faulkner broaches the subject with a generalization on the subject of beginnings. Here's a quote from Faulkner. "With me, a story usually begins with a single idea, or a memory, or a mental picture," unquote. According to Faulkner, then, that thing I'm referring to as a leaf could be a single idea, a memory, or a mental picture from the author's mind. Quote, "The writing of the story," said William Faulkner, "is simply a matter of working up to that moment." Faulkner goes on to describe to the interviewer, Jean Stein, actually, she was her secret girlfriend, the first mental picture, unquote, that enabled him to go on to write The Sound and the Fury. Again, quote, it began with a mental picture. I didn't realize at the time it was symbolical. The picture was of the muddy seat of a little girl's drawers in a pear tree, where she could see through a window where her grandmother's funeral was taking place and report what was happening to her brothers on the ground below. By the time I explained who they were and what they were doing and how her pants got muddy, I realized it would be impossible to get all of it into a short story, and that it would have to be a book. By book, by the way, William Faulkner means a novel. It emerges from these reflections that Faulkner had clearly identified that first leaf we have been talking about, but it seems he realized that this leaf was the germ of a novel, The Sound and the Fury. Only later, once he had set about creating a story that would clarify the picture in his mind. In 1933, 4 years after the novel was published, Faulkner penned an essay about how he wrote The Sound and the Fury. The text had been commissioned for a special new edition of the book by a publisher who had sensed that it was destined to become a classic of modern American literature. But in the end, this new edition was never published, and Faulkner put his introduction aside. Again, another 13 years later, in 1946, the novel Sound and Fury was reissued alongside another Faulkner masterpiece, As I Lay Dying, and the author prepared a revised version of his first introduction for the occasion. Researchers Philip Cohen and Doreen Faulkner have looked closely at the differences between the two versions of Faulkner's introduction to The Sound and the Fury. Their own essay on Faulkner's introductory text can in turn be read as an introduction and a caution of sorts pertaining to my comments today on the subject of beginnings, and indeed to this entire lecture series, the things that creative writers choose to say about the art of the novel should also be considered as elements of their creative output. Quote, any introduction to any book written by a fiction writer is likely to be 50% fiction, said Faulkner, and speaking of the process of writing The Sound and the Fury, added, in the same way, I had no plan at all in mind when I began the book. I have often heard this kind of statement in creative writing schools or when chatting to new debut novelists and more experienced writers. As a craftsman who has devoted many of his years to his work, I would therefore like to emphasize the following point. If you have no plan at all, it will usually be very difficult indeed to proceed beyond the first leaves. In the culture of American creative writing schools, this difficulty is known as writer's block. My view is that this occurs when a book is started with plenty of enthusiasm, but without sufficient planning, that is to say, without enough thought to its other leaves, its branches, and the trunk. Those who read Cohen and Fowler's article will learn that in shaping The Sound and the Fury, which we can all agree is a work of genius, Faulkner based the principal protagonist on the stirrings of his own soul. Faulkner explained the troubled spiritual condition experienced by each of the three brothers in the story and their unusual attachment to their sister by noting that they represented the three primary facets of his own soul. For the three brothers, their sister fulfills a maternal role. Later, when rewriting the introduction, Faulkner, a conservative Southerner, would remove the paragraph in which he had previously admitted to his excessively close bond with his own mother. We have spent enough time on the genesis of the Sound and Fury, but that first idea, the first leaf, which Faulkner pictured for the novel, is situated not at the beginning of the book, but in its closing pages. I'll give you another example. The same is, in fact, true of Tolstoy's Anna Karenina. The event of the person that served as the original inspiration, the first leaf of Tolstoy's Anna Karenina, was a 37-year-old woman called Anna Stepanova, who worked as a housekeeper for one of the great writer's neighbors. We can infer this from a letter written by Tolstoy's wife, who is engaged in I refer to a letter written by Tolstoy's wife. Housekeeper Anna is always fighting and arguing with her husband, who is engaged in various affairs with other women and with the family governesses. One day, Anna Stepanova, her patience runs out, and met with jealousy, she throws herself under an oncoming train. She leaves behind a letter for her husband. "You are my killer. If you wanted to see me, you can view my body on the rails at Yasensky. Tolstoy, who knows the woman's employers well, is present at the autopsy. His wife, Sophia, will describe in her letters how much this incident affected Tolstoy. Anna Stepanova kills herself in 1872, 1 year before Tolstoy began to form the character of Anna Karenina, whose suicide at a rail station closes his novel. Again, it was at the end. The story in his book, Creating Anna Karenina, reminding the reader that both the Anna of the novel and Tolstoy's neighbor had housekeeper Anna had eyes of the same lead-like gray. We are grateful to Bob Blaisdell for writing that wonderful book about making of Anna Karenina. Clearly, Tolstoy pictured his female protagonist's suicide at the train station, in other words, the end of his novel, before he had even started writing the book. This idea ends up shining in its own particular light upon the whole of the novel. Tolstoy will set many allusive scenes in train stations and on train carriages and have Anna's son play with toy train sets through the novel. Vladimir Nabokov wrote about this in a very clever way in his lectures on Russian literature. But in many novels, this preeminent moment we have termed the first leaf takes place in the opening pages, not at the end. A ship sunk in a storm, and the survivors have washed up on a deserted island. A child is born in a house in a bustling city. A character returns after many years to the place where they spent their childhood. Each of these openings promises much to the reader, but on their own, they're not enough to allow the author to continue with the novel. To be able to start writing a novel, the writer needs plenty of what Faulkner referred to as first seeds of the leaves Vladimir Nabokov sometimes called nerve endings, regardless of whether they are situated in the beginning or the middle or the end of the novel. Our imagination must teem with ideas about what the survivors of the shipwreck will do on the island, what they will experience, what kind of trees there will be, what the sea is like. We will need to know more about the newborn child's past, their family history, the experience they will go through. Know these things almost as well as if we had similar experiences ourselves. Before we sit down to write the story of the character returning home after many years, we will need to have thought about the things that will happen to them. Picture these events as scenes from the book. Imagine them as leaves growing on the tree of the novel. Similarly, before we can start writing a novel about a woman who committed suicide at a train station, we must already have imagined many other details from her life and pictured the full outline of numerous leaves. What makes it possible to come up with enough leaves is to spend some time thinking about the plot of the novel and all the other characters who will populate it. These are the questions we need to ask ourselves if we are to delve further into the question of beginnings. 1. When Faulkner first imagined the scene with the sister on the tree, that mental picture he would go on to describe so effectively, where there really, as he himself claimed, no other significant ideas in his mind about what would later become the novel, The Sound and Fury. I suspect there must have been more ideas, Faulkner was eager to write a novel which would combine a first-person narrative with the technique's stream of consciousness, just as in James Joyce's Ulysses, which had been published 7 years ago. Joyce's novel had gained an extraordinary status within global literary circles, becoming nothing less than a symbol for innovation and modernity in literature. It had achieved this level of success in part because Joyce had stayed unerringly true to an approach that eschewed any considerations of popularity or commercial viability. The kind of approach to which we sometimes refer today, many years later, as a, quote, modernist literary ethics. In his essay on how he wrote The Sound and Fury, Faulkner devotes less space to the scene with his sister on the tree than he does to lamenting, complaining about the commercial failure of his early work, spending much more time explaining how he strived to write an unabashedly creative experimental novel without worrying too much about whether it could be published and how it would sell than he ever does on exploring that first mental picture. That is what I refer to as first leaf. 2. Similarly, even as he thought about the woman next door who had thrown herself under a train, Tolstoy also had other important ideas about the novel he was going to write. While Faulkner had emulated James Joyce's Ulysses, Tolstoy wished to write a novel like Flaubert's Madame Bovary, which had been published in France 20 years before to great acclaim and became hugely influential in the global reception of the art of the novel. The two novels can be roughly summarized as follows. Madame Bovary and Anna Karenina are women whose husbands, they are representative of old political order, have failed them, their wives, happy. They each, the woman, pursue an extramarital affair. In fact, there is a romantic affair, and then the heroine, of course, becomes unhappy, are ostracized by society, and finally she commits suicide. both novels have the same general storyline. We are talking about beginnings. Let's not forget then that the first leaf of the novel we would like to write doesn't just carry a picture or an image, but also a new example, a model, an idea. This is the same idea Faulkner was alluding to when he talked in his Paris Review interview about an idea. Remember, he said a picture, an idea, a memory or a mental picture. Ideas are just as powerful as literary models and just as present in the beginnings of a novel as images are. A quick survey of some of the other novels that Madame Bovary inspired will emphasize the intrinsic role of the idea at the origin of every novel. Literary historians have often spoken of the influence of Madame Bovary on Anna Karenina. This is most famously illustrated in the scenes where the married woman, upon seeing her husband again for the first time after meeting her secret lover, immediately becomes aware of her husband's mouth. This is in Flaubert. Or his ears. This is in Tolstoy. And this is noticed by George Steiner, late George Steiner, in his book Tolstoy and Dostoevsky. We are also grateful to him. But I will also point out that Anna Karenina is a completely different novel from Madame Bovary, as we all know. One is an epic portrait of contemporary Russia with a narrative voice that steers clear of cynicism and satire, and a heroine whose personality bears no similarities to Madame Bovary. German author Theodor Fontane's 1894 novel, If We Breathe, features an unhappy woman who is unfaithful to her husband and whose affair is eventually discovered, causing scandal in her social circle and attempts to cover it up and ending in the death of the ostracized heroine. There is also a Turkish literature counterpart, the novel that most influenced by Madame Bovary's tale of an unhappy woman who pursues an extramarital affair is Aşk-ı Memnu, The Forbidden Love, which was first serialized in 1899. It is the most impressive example of the early Turkish novel, a story of Ottoman elites living in waterside mansions on the Bosphorus at the start of the 20th century during the final repressive years of the reign of Sultan Abdülhamid II. While in Madame Bovary and Anna Karenina, the story of the woman who is unfaithful to her husband becomes a broader social scandal. In the German story of If We Breathe and in Istanbul's Aşk-ı Memnu, the dishonor is contained within the family. This reminds me sometimes that traditional conservative values are perhaps stronger in Germany and Turkey than they are in France and Russia. And these two sentences is what is all comparative literature is about, by the way. All that said, our subject today is not the similarity between these novels, but their differences. Remember that over the course of its evolution from the first leaf, the first picture, the first idea, to its final form, a novel will be influenced by many different factors, so much so that its author could never predict the shape the novel will eventually take just by looking at that first idea, that first leaf, or that first picture. If a novel is to be rich, complex, and profound, I think this is essential. Truly great novels never adhere to what their authors imagine when they begin to write the first few sentences. To help us to visualize this idea, let's think back to how James Joyce started writing Ulysses, the greatest classic in the history of the modernist novel. Joyce had initially envisaged this long novel as a short story similar to the Chekhovian stories in his collection, Dubliners. In fact, one of the working titles for Dubliners was Ulysses in Dublin, and scholars of James Joyce will often remind us, insufficiently attentive readers, that some of the characters in Dubliners feature in Ulysses too. To the question of how a novel is, to the question of how a novel is begun, I might smile and respond. It starts as a short story, and thus reveal the secret origin of many other novels too. Some novels are indeed extended short stories, or are composed of chapters, each of which could be written as an individual story. These types of novels repeat the same figures, the same pattern again and again, like sheets of wallpaper. Some novels, on the other hand, can make us forget that they began life as a short story. Once the author has imagined, perhaps even written down the first leaves of the novel's tree, they will go back and revisit them. Meanwhile, their own thinking may have changed significantly, and they will make us use of new ideas to grow fresh leaves upon their tree. But perhaps it would be more accurate to put it this way. In the transition from short story to long and strange new novel, the author will see their dreams and ideas clash and conflict with what they actually end up writing. They will continually change their plans and their minds as they write. A truly great novel is not a wallpaper, but a three-dimensional portrait or a landscape. That deep, dark, and at times mysterious and unknowable quality that makes a novel and separates it from other novels originates in the writer's changes of mind and in their willingness to contradict themselves. Every time the author chooses another leaf to write about, they examine the plot and the events of their novel through fresh eyes and a new perspective, journeying through time and exploring the different forms the story may take in their characters' memoirs. The more the author writes, the farther they will venture from that first leaf on the tree of the novel, creating completely new and different leaves along the way. It is also possible to write a novel without doing any of this and maintaining instead the style and texture of that first leaf throughout the course of the novel. Books of this sort, which replicate the same leaf like a wallpaper, might be termed episodic novels. In these novels, which were commonly serialized in magazines or newspapers, cultural supplements, the author would see each chapter as a variation on the protagonist's adventures. But we shouldn't assume that this kind of novel writing belongs in the past in old newspapers and their culture of serialization or feuilletons dating back to the years when the novel form first rose to prominence. Many writers still employ this method to pen successful novels. There have also been many authors who have written novels that are simultaneously complex and also episodic. Thomas Mann's unfinished but still eminently entertaining novel, Confessions of Felix Krull, is an episodic novel. Mann's greatest masterpiece, The Magic Mountain, on the other hand, is a more complex work which the author created and changed as he wrote. Throughout my career as a novelist, I have always told myself that I should write novels like The Magic Mountain. This novel is very important to me, and so I would like to say a few words now how it began. Just like Faulkner, Thomas Mann started writing about how he began The Magic Mountain, his initial intentions for the novel and its evolution, once his book had already become a classic and he was asked to write prefaces for new editions. In an introduction aimed at American readers, Mann explains that he at first envisaged the novel as a short story. In 1912, Mann's wife, suffering from a not particularly serious affliction of the lungs, would need to spend 6 months at a famous sanatorium in Davos. Mann spent 3 months visiting with his wife at the sanatorium, and after observing and becoming well acquainted with the mountains, the cosmopolitan hospital, the patients, the doctors, and this whole community, daily rituals, he decided to record his impressions in a humorous short story. Thomas Mann notes that the novel's first chapter, entitled arrival is a faithful recreation of his first days in Davos. We might therefore conclude that in this case, the first leave, what I call as first leave, appears at the beginning of the novel. The protagonist arrives at a place which feels new and singular to the reader too, with a curious, peculiar atmosphere that is all its own, and which Mann summarizes as a strange mixture of death and lightheadedness. Mann had already written a short story set in a sanatorium. The title is Tristan. But in planning this novel, he was much more experimental, much more ambitious than he had been for Tristan. He saw a bigger, more encyclopedic, all-encompassing novel in which he would say everything there was to say. In fact, Mann's introduction mentions writers who gathered everything they wished to say in one book or who are remembered today by a single work like Dante. Thomas Mann refers to no one lesser. And the Divine Comedy, or Cervantes, and his Don Quixote. We can therefore surmise that Mann's own ambition was for the Magic Mountain to be on the same level as these works and just as powerful and innovative. The start of his work on the Magic Mountain coincided with the period in Mann's life when he was preparing his most famous novella, Death in Venice, for publication. So, his mind was perhaps occupied by the different kind of literary model Death in Venice embodied, but at the same time, Mann was eager to reconfigure his ironic, humorous short story, Tristan, as a philosophical story, set on a magic mountain, reminiscence of Davos, and exploring, like Death in Venice, themes and preoccupations around life, aesthetics, sexuality, art, and time. The first leaf or leaves imagined by the author were not sufficiently rich as to be able to accommodate all the questions, the fears, the philosophical conundrums that existed in his mind. Many more and varied leaves would be required. In his essay on how he wrote The Magic Mountain, Mann speaks of his patience and notes that his novel may not be particularly easy to understand, but does not make any direct reference to how he pictured and committed to paper the second, third, and further clusters of leaves which have been our subject this week. He does, however, spend a long time discussing the idea behind his novel. Remember Faulkner's idea. As a result, and not unlike Faulkner's essay on the Sound and the Fury, this piece Mann wrote many years after The Magic Mountain was first published becomes a text that provides guidance on how the novel ought to be read, and perhaps even manipulates readers and literary historians' perceptions of the meaning of the novel as intended by the author himself. Remember that James Joyce did the same on the subject of how one ought to interpret Ulysses, a novel he wrote over the course of 7 years and which was based on an initial idea for a short story, as I said. Joyce is known to have provided the literary critic Stuart Gilbert with numerous hints that would later be collected in a book. Read Ulysses along with that book if you have time. Thomas Mann also reveled in the subtleties of the Magic Mountain, proudly proclaiming that in order to fully understand what he refers to as composition, the links between orchestral music and the structure of his novel, the leitmotif technique, and his use of time, we would need to read the novel twice. In his Paris Review interview, Faulkner too suggested in a less authoritarian, more provocative tone that those who couldn't understand his book should try reading it again. Thomas Mann also makes a comment reminiscent of Faulkner's claim that he wrote The Sound and the Fury without any thought to its commercial success. Quote now, we are quoting Thomas Mann. The subject matter of the Magic Mountain was not by its nature suitable for the masses. The authors of these two great classics of modernist literature are vividly aware of the strangeness of indicating how their novels should be read and interpreted, and that is perhaps inappropriate for them to be drawing attention to the philosophical concepts, the aesthetic qualities, the symbolism, and the allegorical elements within their novels. Yet they can't help themselves. They do it anyway. There is no one more conscious of this inherent conflict within modernist ethics, to speak or not to speak, and of the malaise of the author who knows that nobody is better equipped than they are to talk about their own complicated work than Umberto Eco. Like Faulkner and Mann, Umberto Eco also penned an essay on how he came to write his rich and complex postmodernist classic, The Name of the Rose. In this postscript, which is sometimes added to the new editions and reprints of the novel, Eco takes an ironic approach to the modernist writer's dilemma on whether or not to disclose their secrets. If they don't, will someone else eventually come along to uncover them? Is the eternal Goethe and Eckermann question. As he addresses his readers' curiosity about how the title of his novel, The Name of the Rose, relates to its subject, he adapts a tone of scholarly irony and double meaning, and rightly so, for this is anything but an obvious question. I'm reading now, quoting from Umberto Eco. A narrator should not supply interpretations of his work, otherwise he would not have written a novel which is a machine for generating interpretations, unquote, he writes, proceeding to note that one of the principal obstacles to the realization of this lofty aim is that every novel must have a title. Eco continues, the rest of the piece, one of the most amusing texts ever written about how novels are interpreted but not to be, how novels are interpreted but ought not to be interpreted by their own authors is in the same cheerful vein. This remarkable essay also abounds with clues on how to begin a novel and how to keep going with it. And you know, in these lectures, I'm also talking to a young author who wants to write a novel. Eco continues, the rest of the piece, I have been teaching comparative literature at Columbia University for 16 years, and inevitably, I too have sometimes found myself setting my own novels as reading and having to discuss my own work. Aware as I am of awkwardness involved in interpreting my own novels at the start of every semester, I always tell my students the following story. In 1957, a group of professors who were great admirers of Vladimir Nabokov were considering offering him a professorship of modern literature at Harvard University. But some of their colleagues, particularly those who specialized in Russian literature, were against this idea, displeased with Nabokov's contempt for Russian writers, particularly Dostoevsky. And the most famous one who didn't like Nabokov was Roman Jakobson. The debate grew increasingly heated. In the American Years, the second volume of his brilliant two-volume biography of Nabokov, Brian Boyd writes, quote, Nabokov's advocates asked if he were not a very distinguished novelist in his own right, meaning Nabokov. To which Roman Jakobson, the famous formalist linguist from Harvard's Department of Slavic Literature, replied, quote, Roman Jakobson, gentlemen, even if one allows that he is an important writer, are we next to invite an elephant to be a professor of zoology? So this is my situation talking here. I hope you understand me. When I'm about to introduce one of my own novels to a seminar, I always tell this story first and then declare, in class this semester, I'll sometimes, also in Collège de France, be a professor and sometimes be an elephant. My students understand that in the latter guise, I will be talking mostly of my own writing, of my own intentions, of the hidden symmetries and obscure facets within my work, but that when we discuss other writers' novels, I'll be speaking more like craftsman, sometimes also a craftsman who makes gossip. Now, as we approach the end of the first class at the Collège de France, I will finish in the manner of an elephant, breaking into a classroom with a few brief words on how I like to begin my novels. 1. I will not start writing a book, and neither should you, if you're planning to write one, until I have already dreamed up, noted down, and analyzed much more than the novel's first few leaves, at least around 1/10 of them, perhaps. As well as these initial leaves, I must also have some fairly well-developed ideas about the branches they will hang on and the main trunk. I will constantly making notes in a notebook about all the details I'm building and imagining. These notes usually end up filling up several notebooks and are about as long as the finished novel. Before I start a novel, I will try as much as I can to write down and fully define the sequence of events and the plot. Second, once I excitedly completed the first leaves, the early pages and chapters, my face will begin to drop. Before me now is a cluster of leaves, which is difficult and tiring to picture. When you're struck, the best thing to do is to start writing about the leaves that are at the opposite end of the novel's tree. So, if the first leaves of my novel were found in the upper north-facing branches of the tree, I will start writing or trying to write about the leaves on the bottom, south-facing branches. So I'm in the mood of advice to young writers again. For novelists who are accustomed to advancing their plot in a linear, continuous fashion, this is no simple task. But once you have already determined the plot and the events therein, it is not that difficult. 3, I'm ending, don't worry. 3, by this point, it will have become easier to imagine the leaves and branches that fill up the space between the first and the second cluster of leaves, and to identify all the folds in the tree trunk. So I'll keep going, little by little. The more I write, the easier it becomes to imagine and write down the previously unimagined leaves. Emboldened by this newfound ease, I will often go back and rewrite passages I had already written. These rewrites, in turn, will make it easier to envision other parts of the novel that I have not yet thought of. Next week, I will return to this feeling of ease and discuss the contradiction that exists between the picture in the novelist's mind and their ideas. That is to say, the paradox of the novelist, coming soon in this room.